We're going to do a noodle-headed deep dive today into a couple of books, and basically we're finishing off our Wallace week where we've been examining a bunch of different old essays from A Supposedly Fun Thing I'll Never Do Again, and then tie them into a few other tennis-related aspects. So I'm going to fun on a Friday. We're going to look at the original tennis essay on Michael Joyce, where DFW went and did some reportage at the Montreal Open, an ATP tour stop. We're then going to look at the later Roger Federer as religious experience. And then I was hoping to tie them all together with a look at another author's work, Jeff Dyer's The Last Days of Roger Federer, which talks about a point in Federer's career and tennis, and Dyer's own experiential essays basically on aging and sort of not being able to play the sport he loves anymore. So yeah, I'm hoping that's going to give us like a nice beginning, middle, and end. I'm not sure exactly how we'll get to all of them in 75 minutes, but we're noodleheads around here. We're not geniuses, so we'll figure it out somehow. Let's start with the Joyce essay and basically the fun part, the bit about youth and fun. So let's get into the book chat. Tennis player Michael Joyce's professional artistry as a paradigm of certain stuff about choice, freedom, limitation, joy, and grotesquerie and human completeness. So you can see this is like, we're still very much in like early David Foster Wallace here. He's overly wordy, verbose, at the sort of height of his youth, brimming with excitement. And Michael Joyce in this piece is kind of like, I think, a bit of a double for the author. But then there's a transition where it goes on, and Wallace kind of acknowledges and realizes that his own athletic dreams could never be, which I think, many of us realize and feel that as we get older, right? Let's check the focus here. Good enough. So, audio check here with the cafe au lait. Let's zoom in and wait for the bells to end. All right, bell is out. We're going to get into this essay. Thank you for your patience.
Good morning.
Okay, so he situates us first, exact, precise clarity, 1 p.m. Saturday, July 22nd, 95, Stade Yari Tennis Complex in Montreal. It's a beauty. God, hopefully one day we can watch The End of the American Empire. No, The Decline of the American Empire by Denis Arcand. Beautiful Quebecois film set in Montreal and the surrounds. And there's some tennis court stuff in that too. So it's the qualifying rounds for the Canadian Open, a major stop on the ATP hardcourt circuit, and a Canadian college star, Dan Brackus, is about to take on Michael Joyce. So we're setting it up here. But Joyce was a world-class player, a champion at Junior Wimbledon, and then David Foster Wallace gets into his sort of first flourish here. The rhetorical assumption here is that you've probably never heard of Michael Joyce. So he's trying to tell us, like, even though this guy is world-class, right? We've never heard of him. He's a nobody, even though he's a somebody. So gives into some background of Joyce, and then he tells us, second person here. So just like the shipping out essay we talked about yesterday has these sort of references to that famous old Jamaica Kincaid essay on Caribbean tourism where she says, "You're in the deep blue waters, you're doing this." And the whole thing in second person is this sort of send up of travel writing that's an advertisement. He gets into that here. You're invited to try to imagine what it would look like to be among the 100 best in the world at something, at anything. I've tried to imagine. It's hard. And this is a great way to just like immediately jump right in and relate to the reader. Obviously, this was published in a magazine. I think this piece is also originally from Harper's, where Foster Wallace got his big break. So he's talking to not a sporty crowd per se, but to a, well-read academic-y crowd. Often, I think it's hard for any of us to really imagine what an athlete this good is like, and the sort of point of this essay is both for Foster Wallace to reckon with his own, shortcomings as an athlete or the impossibility of perfection in his given niche, but also to, just to sort of lavish and enjoy it, the surrounding, enjoy his trip to Montreal, right? Professional tennis tournaments, like sports teams, have distinctive traditional colors. Wimbledon's is green, the Volvo International's is light blue, the Canadian Open's is emphatically red. And as a Canadian, I love this. The tournament's title sponsor, De Maurier Cigarettes, has ads and logos all over the place in red and black. And red is, of course, also the color of the Canadian flag, right? The base of the grandstand itself is decked out in red and black bunting, so that any kind of a place looks either a Kremlin funeral or a really elaborate brothel. God, you gotta love that stuff. Just, what a joker. Okay, I want to get into the actual stuff where he starts talking about tennis now. So he's describing all these players, and there's some really beautiful bits here. And this is this sort of bit where he gets into, and one day we'll have a look at Up Simba, the piece where he traveled with John McCain, a la sort of Hunter S. Thompson on the campaign train, Fear and Loathing. But he gets us behind the scenes also by really describing the people and talking to them. So there's descriptions of tennis players, which I think really informed Infinite Jest, are lovely. At the Radisson de Governors, the players tend to congregate in the lobby, where there's a draw sheet for the qualies up on a cork bulletin board, and a multilingual tournament official behind a long desk. And the players stand around in the air conditioning and wet hair and sandals, and employ about 40 languages, and wait for results of matches to go up on the board, and for their own next matches' schedules to get posted. Some of the players listen to personal stereos. None seem to read. So again, there's this moment where this is distancing himself, right? How unlike these professional players he is. They all have the unhappy, self-enclosed look of people who spend huge amounts of time on planes and waiting around in hotel lobbies. The look of people who have to create an envelope of privacy around them with just their expressions. Most of these players seem either extremely young, new guys trying to break onto the tour, or conspicuously older, like over 30, with that tan look, tournament and faces lined from years in the trenches of tennis's minor leagues. So you set up this nice opposition here between youth and aging, which I hope we're going to be able to get to when we talk about The Last Days of Federer by Jeff Dyer. But I want to remember here too that, I'm older than these old or washed up sort of tennis players who are hanging on by a thread. But David Foster Wallace is not. He's very young still. I mean, he's fresh out of college and he's writing for Harper's. He's probably in his mid-20s, maybe late 20s. We'll see if he tells us, but I'd guess he's in the sort of like 23 to 27 range when he's writing this. So he's still just a kid, even if he's unable to acknowledge that. I'm going to just adjust here. The realities of the men's professional tennis tour bear about as much resemblance to the lush finals you see on TV as a slaughterhouse does to a well-presented cut of restaurant sirloin. So again, getting into this idea of television and media presentation versus the reality of the behind the scenes, and that's what he wants to take us in, right? He was taking us on a tour of the behind the scenes, all access sort of VIP thing. For every Sampras Agassi final we watched, there's been a week-long tournament. A pure medical single elimination battle among 32, 64, or 128 players, of whom the finalists are the last men standing. You probably know that already, but a player has to be eligible to enter the tournament in the first place. So this bit I love, and it makes me think about how, these lavish sort of quote unquote behind the scenes documentaries that you get now on Amazon Prime or on Netflix, and whether it's sort of like following along with Sunderland or, a season with the Toronto Maple Leafs or Arsenal, they're just like an extension of the prime cut of sirloin. Even though they fake or give us the faux reality of a behind the scenes with players, what we're actually just doing is like, seeing the player do their bicep curl, seeing the player have a little chit chat with the coach or a pep talk, and they're, give us no real access to the players as humans, to their lives. And I think, in fact, it's the opposite, right? They're these grand, sweeping, sort of cinematic view of the player as larger than life, as heroic. There's a nice one of these for tennis. I think it actually, did it steal the title of that Woody Allen movie, Match Point? Something like that. But there is a nice one of these on Netflix for tennis that we could watch a bit of that in the stream. Maybe, I don't know, as a lead up to US Open or something. Let me know. All right, he's going to go into the actual practice. The whole things get messier as he tries to describe the logistics of Canadian Open qualies. But we're not going to do that because their complexity without boring you mindless is a reality. And he knows that. But let's get into the bit where he actually starts connecting with Michael Joyce. I'm just going to insert a small digression to talk about Richard Krajicek. The top seed this weekend is Richard Krajicek, a 6'5" Dutchman who wears a tiny white-billed hat in the sun and rushes the net like it owes him money, and in general plays like a rabid crane. Both his knees are bandaged. He's in the top 20 and hasn't had to play qualies for years. But for this tournament, he missed the entry deadline. Found all the wild cards already given to uniquely deserving Canadians, and with phlegmatic low country cheer, decided to go ahead and play the weekend qualies for match practice. This is fun. And this is also like the slaughterhouse effect, where Krajicek is just about to absolutely destroy some kid trying to make it from the satellite tournament. Fun things. Okay. Now's when we get into Michael Joyce. Michael Joyce is seeded third. If you're wondering why Joyce, who's ranked above the 85 cutoff, is having to play qualies, gird yourself for one more bit of complication. He loves this kind of stuff, right? The bureaucracy, the technical details, the backroom functioning and office logistics of an industry and a world are really sort of David Foster Wallace's bread and butter. 6 weeks ago, Joyce's ranking was not above the cutoff, and that's when the Canadian entry deadline was. And that's the ranking the tournament committee went on when they made up the main draw. So Joyce's ranking jumped from 119 to around 80 after Wimbledon, where he beat Mark Rossett, ranked 11 in the world, and reached the round of 16. Despite a bout of mononucleosis, aka the kissing disease, how does Foster Wallace skip that choke? That kept him in bed through part of spring. Joyce is having the best year ever as a pro, and has jumped from 140 to 79. It seems to me that Joyce, like Krajicek, might be excused for brooding darkly on the fact that 4 wildcards in Canadians' main draw have been dispensed to Canadians ranked substantially lower than 88 or 85. But Joyce is stoic about it. This is the setup stuff I love. Wallace really sort of creating this opposition between what it takes to be a real, literal pro player and what he is. And this stuff really goes on to inform his cowboy Canadian Quebecois tennis star at the school in Infinite Jest, right? His name is it John Wayne or something? He has a movie cowboy name. It's quite a funny little bit of double entendre. But he much resembles, Michael Joyce and other aspects, little sort of tidbits, quotidian pieces of this Quebecois-ness. I think David Foster Wallace had some sort of connection to Canada too through his mother. Maybe his mom was at University of Toronto or something like that for a while. Anyways, Michael Joyce is listed in the ATP player guide as 5'11" and 165, but in person he's more like 5'9". On the stadium court he looks compact and stocky. The quickest way to describe him would be to say he looks like a young and slightly buff David Caruso. He's fair-skinned and has reddish hair and the kind of patchy, vaguely public goatee of somebody who isn't quite able to yet grow real facial hair. Where he plays in the heat, he wears a hat. He wears Fila clothes and Yonex rackets and is paid to do so. His face is childishly full, and while it isn't freckled, it somehow looks like it ought to be freckled. A lot of professional tennis players look like lifeguards, the kind of extreme tan that looks like it's penetrated to the subdermal layer and will be retained to the grave. Lovely stuff. I mean, this is just like trademark Wallace description, over the top, too much. Let's have a look at the actual Michael Joyce just to take some hot air out of that description. Michael Joyce, tennis player. Yeah, there he is. Now also an old man, of course, as we'll see later. Time's arrow. Time's arrow goes in one way, but I think this is pretty close to probably what Michael Joyce looked like in the 90s when David Foster Wallace was talking about him. Maybe even younger. No, this is Vince. Love it. Oh, String Theory. That'd be a great piece to read. This is the actual piece, right? Published in the actual magazine by David Foster Wallace. I gotta save that. So that must be a photo of thing. Wow, love it. The internet, a beautiful thing, folks. Okay, onwards and upwards we go. I want to get into where Joyce is actually playing here. Okay, it's 1:30 p.m. Joyce has broken Brackus' serve once and is up 3-1 in the first set and is receiving. Brackus is in the multi-brand clothes of somebody without an endorsement contract. He's well over 6 feet tall, and like many large male collegians, his game is built around his serve. At 0:15, his first serve is flat and 118 miles per hour and way out to Joyce's backhand, which is a two-hander and hard to lunge effectively with. But Joyce lunges plenty effectively and sends the ball back down the line to the Canadian's forehand, deep in the court and with such flat pace that Brackus has to stutter step a little and backpedal to get set up. Clearly, he's used to playing guys for whom 118 mumps out wide would be an outright ace, or at least produce such a weak return that he could move up easily and put the ball away. And Brackus now sends the ball back up the line, high over the net, loopy with topspin. Not all that bad a shot, considering the fierceness of the return. And a topspin shot that'd back most tennis players up and put them on the defensive. Such a DFWism, but Michael Joyce, whose level of tennis is such that he moves in on balls hit with topspin and hits them on the rise, moves in and takes the ball on the rise and hits a backhand cross so tightly angled that nobody alive could get to it. Oh man, that is just the kind of passage that gives me chills, especially if you're a sports fan, if you're a DFW fan. This kind of writing is so beautiful, so poetic, but also so visceral. I mean, I can literally picture and feel it. Of course, yeah, whatever. I was a mediocre, recreational tennis player and have watched tennis on TV and seen a few tournaments in person. But this idea of hitting on a rise means you're taking the ball when it's still going up, rather than after the peak when it's declining towards the zenith. You're hitting it before the zenith, and it's aggressive and it's fast and it's intense to play someone who's hitting a ball on the rise. Beautiful stuff. So let's get into some of the bit where the I, David Foster Wallace's I, the first person, starts to reflect on his own tennis experiences and how, inadequate his reality is when he's faced to look at someone like Michael Joyce playing top-level tennis. Oh man, just a side note here. Agassi, who is 25, so that gives us the year of this essay, and of whom you have heard and then some, is kind of Michael Joyce's hero. Just last week at the Lag Mason Tennis Classic in DC, in wet mitten heat that had players vomiting on court and defaulting all over the place, Agassi beat Joyce in the third round of the main draw 6-2, 6-2. What I wouldn't give to go back in time and see 25-year-old Agassi playing live. Every once in a while now during this quality match, Joyce will look over at his coach next to me in the player guest section of the grandstand and grin and say something like, Agassi would have killed me on that shot. Oh, this is beautiful, right? So being able to see a top 100 person in the world at something who's not quite at, right? He's plateaued extremely high, but is not quite at that next level where, a literal tennis god like Andre Agassi was. I love it. This stuff is good. Oh, and I've got an actual highlight here. Who knew? Agassi is every bit as fast as Michael Chang, and watch AA on TV sometimes as he's walking between points. He takes these tiny, violently pigeon-toed steps, the stride of a man whose feet weigh basically nothing. This reminds me of watching the young Rafa. I mean, he had this sort of like enormous, intense muscularity and Neanderthalism to him. You know, he looked like a brute force out there. That intensely overgrown left arm, like his hitting arm, Rafa's, was just monstrous. But then he would, you've all seen it, he'd do these sort of shirt flicks and these like icky little things and touch his hair and whatever before he served. Notoriously slow to get up to the line and serve was Rafa. And one of the things I always remembered him is that, the feet. The feet that just sort of like twinkle-toed, like a beautiful football player, like Messi or something. It was like he was wearing ballet slippers, even though he had the body of a compact or tighter Arnold Schwarzenegger. Incredible stuff. So, back to the essay. This business of seeing is important enough to explain, except for the serve. Power in tennis is a matter of strength, but of timing. This is one reason why so few top tennis players are muscular. This is, of course, before the era of Rafa. But you have to be able to hit that ball on the rise. It's more important to win the time. No bigger rackets that people play with now have shifted this a bit because they've created a much larger sweet spot, but still relevant. Any normal adult male can hit a tennis ball with pro pace. The trick is being able to hit the ball both hard and accurately. If you can get your body in just the right position and time your stroke so you hit the ball in just the right spot, waist level, just slightly out in front of you, with your weight moving in from your back leg to your front leg as you make contact, you can both cream the ball and direct it. This makes me think of this sort of famous quote about, NFL quarterbacks, right? So like a good quarterback can throw a ball through a doorway from 50 yards away. A great quarterback can throw a ball through a window from 50 yards away. And like the best quarterback can take the doorknob off the door with the ball from 50 yards away. And it's the same in tennis, right? Like any of us can hit a ball 100 miles an hour, but it's going to fly up and you're going to lose it over the court and have to go be looking for your ball in the woods all day. Whereas like the best tennis player can put it in the box, or the extremely elite tennis player can take the dust off the edge of paint in the far corner of the net, right? Like the far corner. Anywho, Agassi's vision is literally 1 in a billion, and it allows him to hit his ground strokes as hard as he can just about every time. Joyce, whose hand-eye coordination is superlative, in the top 1% of all athletes everywhere, he's been exhaustively tested, still has to take some incremental bit of steam off most of his ground strokes if he wants to direct them. A matter of millimeters and milliseconds, a certain kind of vision is crucial. I've been thinking about this a lot lately with Formula One and the drivers too, right? They look like these tiny sort of, fast twitch jockey guys. And they give you the reality if you're watching Drive to Survive or behind the scenes things of being like, oh, I could do that, Or also sort of like the silliness of like, oh man, they're just teenagers. They're just kids. But it's like the reality is they have to be just kids because like a high-level video game player, right? Like, I mean, people don't respect enough the fact that in esports, the hand-eye coordination and the fast twitch of, like, fingers and response time is this. It's in millimeters, microseconds, and the vision connection is crucial. And if you don't have that, there's no way, there's absolutely no way you're going to be anything like, a top-level gamer on Twitch or a top-level tennis player or hockey player. No amount of practice. Sorry. And, okay, this is good. So this is yet now when David Foster Wallace starts talking about the brain aspect of it. Positions and predilections and the ballistic features of the ball he sent you are factored in. No CPU yet existent could compute the expansion of variables for even a single exchange. Smoke would come out of the mainframe. The sort of thinking involved is the sort that can be done only by a living and highly conscious entity, and then only unconsciously, i.e. by combining talent with repetition to such an extent that the variables are combined and controlled without conscious thought. In other words, serious tennis is a kind of art. Bam. This is the crux of it. This is the thesis. This is what he's been building up to. I love this bit. Let's put some green on it. It's also, sort of what I was just getting at. This idea that the practice is necessary to make the perfection rote, to turn your body into a machine at one level is maybe like thinking fast and thinking slow, Daniel Kahneman, right? And it's so that one system of function, it's not that it's turned off, it's turned on extremely highly, but it's totally separate and operating your body while your conscious mind is thinking of something else. And in the case of tennis, what you're thinking of is a chess match. So one part of your brain is thinking 5, 6, 7, 8 shots in advance. And the other part of your brain is flawlessly controlling, a well-timed machine. And that sort of race car analogy, I think, holds for that as well, right? That you might think, oh, wow, yeah, maybe I could do that or whatever. Maybe you could take a car around for a single lap. But the reality is, let's pick one, when Charles Leclerc is entering turn 3, he's thinking about turn 7, right? He's not just thinking about the pass that he wants to make on the car in front of him. He's thinking about how he's going to pace himself this lap and hit turn 7, or if he can catch someone else in 22 laps, right? There has to be actual strategy. And it's that higher level thought coupled with the intense physical direction. Humanity at its best. Okay, so now we're talking about, this is where truly great athlete and where the author, David Foster Wallace, starts to reflect on his own inability to actually niche down and be so dedicated to one tiny thing. Pardon me. And this is what I wanted to get into in this essay. It's what really pulled me in. Watch a truly great athlete. We'll reward him with celebrity and adulation, and will even go so far as to buy products and services he endorses. But we prefer not to countenance the kind of sacrifices the professional grade athlete has made to get so good at one particular thing. I think we can all relate to this, right? One particular thing. This is the key. Oh, we'll pay lip service to these sacrifices. We'll invoke lush cliches about the lonely heroism of Olympic athletes, the pain and analgesia of football, the early rising and hours of practice and restricted diets, the privations, the pre-fight celibacy, etc. But the actual facts of the sacrifices repel us when we see them. Basketball geniuses who cannot read, sprinters who dope themselves, defensive tackles who shoot up bovine hormones until they collapse or explode. We prefer not to consider the shockingly vapid and primitive comments uttered by athletes in the post-contest interviews, or to imagine what impoverishments in one's mental life would allow people to actually think in the simplistic way great athletes seem to think. Note the way up-close and personal profiles of professional athletes strain so hard to find evidence of a rounded human life. Outside interests and activities, charities, values beyond the sport. We ignore what's obvious, that most of this straining is farce. It's farce because the realities of top-level athletics today require an early and total commitment to one pursuit, an almost ascetic focus, a subsumption of almost all other features of human life to their one chosen talent and pursuit, a consent to live in a world that, like a child's world, is very serious and very small. Oh man, great, beautiful summation. And I think we should end with this essay here, because that's really sort of the conclusion that Foster Wallace comes to. And of course, there's this parallel to him as a writer, wondering if he can actually become, a top 100 writer of the century or whatever, and if he has the actual sort of single-mindedness to niche down to that tiny of a point. So now we're going to skip ahead to a later point in the author's career, and also a later point in the tennis world, when Roger Federer is the unquestioned, not just best tennis player alive, but at the time considered the best tennis player in the history of the sport. And David Foster Wallace goes and sees him and writes a piece on him for the New York Times called Roger Federer as Religious Experience. And I had this wonderful look at it. I'm going to turn off my webcam here and let you scan through it. This is a beautiful little graphic novel that's been adapted from this piece. So I want to have a look at that. And the artist's name, credit where credit is due, Emmanuel Rosso. So check him out. Lovely. The cross swords of the pen and the tennis racket. Roger's attention to detail. Almost anyone who loves tennis and follows the men's tour on television has, over the last few years, had what might be termed Roger Federer moments. These are times as you watch the young Swiss play when the jaw drops and eyes protrude and sounds are made that bring spouses in from other rooms to see if you're okay. The moments are more intense if you've played enough tennis to understand the impossibility of what you just saw him do. The specific thesis here is that if you've never seen the young man play live, then you are apt to have what's one of the tournament's press bus drivers describes as a bloody near religious experience. So maybe he's at Wimbledon and not the US Open here, and that's why the reference to Britishisms and the bloodyism. But you can also see the writing. It's so much sharper, the clarity. He gets straight to his point here in a way that he just wasn't earlier. And partly it's because this is for the New York Times and not Harper's, but I think it's also just the author has come to a different level of his own ability and sharpness and quickness of thinking and writing. And it, to me, is a really nice synergy, this moment of David Foster Wallace being sort of at the height of his career and Federer being young enough that he's on the rise here. You know, it's way before Rafa or Djokovic can come at him. He's the number one, but he's still getting better. And at this era, I mean, crowds went insane for Roger because it was like a wall, right? I mean, people couldn't get a ball by him. Unbelievable stuff. Let's go. Discovering DFW leaves a deep sigh inside, and then it becomes a battle of resistance against the urge of reading any word he ever wrote, aware that there would not be any new ones. This is a reflection from the artist. Here's the quote from DFW again. Beauty is not the goal of competitive sports, but high-level sports are a prime venue for the expression of human beauty. The relation is roughly that of courage to war. The human beauty we're talking about here is the beauty of a particular type. It might be called kinetic beauty. Its power and appeal are universal. It has nothing to do with sex or cultural norms. What seems to have to do with, really, is human beings' reconciliation with the fact of having a body. Of course, in men's sports, no one ever talks about the beauty or grace of the body. Men may profess their love of sports, but that love must always be cast and enacted in the symbology of war. So what we're getting at here is the absolute beauty and grace of Roger Federer and of athletics in general. And I think there's this idea, this sort of, harkening back to thinking of Michelangelo's and Greek sculptures here. And David Foster Wallace, as an artist himself, really trying to reconcile and recognize that that's part of the appeal of athletics and sports and watching, is a recognition of beauty and aesthetics, and a worship of it too, right? The religious experience, bringing in, certainly Foster Wallace went back and forth and talked a lot about his own religious connections and Christianity. And here clearly is a moment of transcendence, right? You're sliding through time. Time is disappearing as you watch the beauty of sports and of that perfect tennis shot, which was described in the prior essay. And here it is, the height, right? The crescendo, the zenith of physical existence and mental existence meeting and connecting. Okay, let's get through these 12 pages, and then let's get into the Jeff Dyer and look at that other side of the crescendo, the downswing of physicality and reality and old age, which, of course, as a 40-pluser, that's where I'm at, so I want to dig into it. Okay. For reasons that are not well understood, war's codes are safer for most of us than love's, especially young people's, right? Foster Wallace is older here, but he's still, I did my own little description of him, and then we're going to read the much more beautiful and aesthetically pleasing description of Foster Wallace. You too may find them so, in which case Spain's mesomorphic and totally martial Rafael Nadal is the man's man for you. He of the unsleeved biceps and kabuki self-exhortations. Plus, Nadal is also Federer's nemesis. This is beautiful. And so there's this dynamic now of seeing, it's not just really for Foster Wallace, I think, about Nadal and Federer meeting, who they met at July 9th, 2006, Wimbledon. So that's almost 11 years to the date after the Montreal essay, which was it July 22, 91 or 95? So it's either 11 or 15 years later, and a very different moment in tennis and the world. We're going to continue here. A top athlete's beauty is next to impossible to describe directly or to evoke. One thing is, it's not entirely televisable, at least not entirely. TV tennis has its advantages, but these advantages have disadvantages, and chief among them is a certain illusion of intimacy. That's what I think of when I think of that Match Point Netflix behind the scene. It's an illusion of intimacy. A large part of what's lost is the sheer physicality of top tennis, a sense of the speeds at which the ball is moving and the players are reacting. The truth is, TV tennis is to live tennis pretty much as video porn is to the felt reality of human love. So, as someone who's seen some real high-level tennis at the Toronto tournament a few times, and I saw Federer in person just hitting the ball around. So I didn't even watch one of his match. I think the final that year was Roddick versus someone. Might have been Roddick versus Raonic, the Canadian kid. But regardless, watching Federer hit, right, like practice, just back and forth with his coach over the net, the level of like finesse, the smooth physical beauty and the way he moves is sort of it's like ethereal. Like, I mean, it really does look, it's like, I don't know what the comparison is here. Maybe the comparison is watching the lead ballerina, right? Like, just seeing one of the greats, someone who's so minutely and germane to the fact of their own body. Whereas, you know, I bump into my desk with my hip, I knock my coffee over, right? Like, my mortality, my humanness, my flaws, my errs are so much like Hamlet, so much a presence of my mind and my body constantly. Whereas these people have just perfected control over themselves, really. And now's when we get into the stuff where he talks about the changes in tennis. So today's pros truly are measurably bigger, stronger, and better conditioned. And high-tech composite rackets really have increased their capacities for pace and spin. How then someone of Federer's consummate finesse has come to dominate the men's tour is a source of wide and dogmatic confusion. Again, this recall of dogma and religion and what's happening. There are three valid explanations for Federer's ascendancy. One kind of involves mystery and metaphysics, and is, I think, the closest to the real truth. The others are more technical and make for better journalism. So we're going to talk about this metaphysical one, and then we're going to shift into Dyer and his approach to Federer years later as a sort of reflection piece on his aging and also on Federer's aging. The metaphysical explanation is that Roger Federer is one of those rare preternatural athletes who appear to be exempt, at least in part, from certain physical laws. He's never hurried or off balance. The approaching ball hangs for him a split second longer than it ought to. His movements are lithe rather than athletic, like Ali, Jordan, Maradona, and Gretzky. He seems both less and more substantial than the men he faces. I think Messi's hit this point too. As a huge football fan and a footballer, and I played soccer at least up to college level, the footwork of Messi, and that actually just saying the word footwork makes me think both of Federer and of Kobe too. I mean, footwork is that aesthetic beauty that a dancer has, and the control and the rhythm and the pace, and it all just comes together, and it appears to be magical, right? It appears to be more than human. So imagine that you're a person with preternaturally good reflexes. Again, we're getting to the second person, which I love when David Foster Wallace does that. Coordination and speed, and that you're playing high-level tennis. Your experience in play will not be that you possess phenomenal reflexes and speed. Rather, it will seem to you that the tennis ball is quite large and slow-moving, and that you always have plenty of time to hit it. That is, you won't experience anything like the empirically real quickness and skill that the live audience watching the tennis ball move so fast they hiss and blur will attribute to you. Velocity is just one part of it. Now we're getting technical. So this part I'm going to move through, and I think we'll see if we can get to the sum up, and then we're going to try and get into the actual reflection piece. Okay, so subtlety, touch, and finesse are not dead in the power baseline era, for it is still very much the power baseline era. Federer is a first-rate, kick-ass power baseliner. It's just that that's not all he is. The thing with Federer is that he's Mozart and Metallica at the same time, and the harmonies somehow exquisite. Genius is not replicable. Inspiration, though, is contagious and multiform, and even just to see close-up power and aggression made vulnerable to beauty is to feel inspired and, in a fleeting mortal way, reconciled. So, lovely stuff. Hopefully, if you found any of these talks and book chats this week on David Foster Wallace, you can see that that's in a little bit what I'm doing too, right? Taking the inspiration of a great writer and reconciling it with the mortal reality of, the real shifts in the planet and in literature. And gone are the days of 70-page essays in Harper's. We're into 7-second book talk reflections on TikTok. So that's just reality. And can we find sort of an ethereal haiku artist writer of a David Foster Wallace ilk in the 2030s? I hope so. Now, let's move into Dyer. Okay, so there's a lot of sports references here. There's a lot of side talk. We're going to start with him discussing Manchester United because I'm a Man U fan, and he's talking about George Best. George Best had quit football. George Best is the man who won England a World Cup in '66. He actually returned after quitting, and it was not until January 1, 1974 that he played his last match for Manchester United before the long and wandering years of boozy decline. This was not the first time I have heard of someone's career coming to an end, but it was the first time I knew of anyone stopping doing something they loved, the thing that gave their life meaning. And I'm hoping this essay will help me be able to reconcile a bit to this understanding of why would Foster Wallace commit suicide when he was, or why would he leave the beauty of his own writing and his own niche? Retirement in the world I grew up in, the world of poorly paid, often unpleasant and unrewarding work, was something my relatives began to look forward to from a surprisingly early age. It was a form of promotion, practically an ambition. Now this is interesting too, because Jeff Dyer was, I think, a scholarship boy and went on one of the scholarships to the famous England universities, Oxford or Cambridge or whatever, and then worked his way up through newspapers, a thing that seems very old-fashioned now to go up through the classic gatekeepers. But I certainly relate to him to having grown up in blue-collar surrounds and then, be a part of the, white-collared or world of the mind. Neither of my parents could swim. Both regarded the ability to do so as one of many things that were beyond their reach, and were content with this third-level endorsement of their child's aquatic survival skills as sufficient evidence of generational advance. I love this. And I'm very curious now about the idea of generational regress, right? Like if there was an upswing and we're now actually on a downswing, and where I and then those of you coming after me and my children fit into this upswing and downswing. Dyer here is talking about his own failed football bits, and if you get into his old love novel that he wrote about his 20s when he was living in Paris, I think it's called Paris Trance. Oh, gorgeous book. Maybe we can revisit that on the book chat one day. He talks a lot about football, playing football, just pick up football, but also falling in love with Paris and with romance and with writing. Paris Trance, stunning novel. I gave up playing football gradually, the intervals between games increasing because of the injuries until the games became intervals between injuries. Oh, this I can relate to today. Finally, here we are, into tennis. You've got to serve somebody, he once sang. That claim might have been specific to his born-again period, but certainly you've got to do something. This becomes problematic when you can do anything, and the whole world wants nothing more than to serve and see you. Just talking about Bob Dylan here. I can't remember if this is before or after Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize. Maybe the money helps even if, at some level, in the most fabulous quantities, it doesn't help at all. Could it be that the way to get out of going through all these things twice is to go through them 2,000 times? Strange thing is that a life like Dylan's is so beyond comprehension as to seem almost meaningless, the result of some tangled extrapolation of the way his songs have brought so much meaning to the lives of people who have spent so much time trying to work out what they might mean. This is interesting. Reading Dyer after Foster Wallace, you can see the influence, I think, of Dyer, who is a straight contemporary reading DFW, but then also he has this sort of prosaic, recursive British thing happening. He's much drier in tone too, less show-offy, less verbose, less of the classic American hot-dogging grandstanding that David Foster Wallace does. Also, he's older, of course. Let's try and skip ahead to... Oh, there's a bit on spontaneous prose in Kerouac here. Yes. I think that some of Foster Wallace's prose reads in a kind of, spontaneous prose way. Recording. I'll come back. Michaela has my coffee. The hard-won struggle to master spontaneous prose both enabled Kerouac to write a great book and condemned him for the rest of his creative life, to banging out pretty terrible ones. By 1961, he was conscious of the paradoxical and hidden costs of his style as composition. Quote, what happened was, as soon as I had made a formal discovery of spontaneous prose, it wasn't spontaneous anymore. In fact, he went on, I think I've forgotten how to write by now. As the liberating idea of wild, spontaneous yelks hardened into an inflexible method, Kerouac became a prisoner of the FU freedom he had helped unleash. Conscious of how spontaneity could become stale, he announced his intention of going back to the careful writing of Town and City, his first book. And this, to me, is something like the tragedy of David Foster Wallace, that a writer who became so known for youthful exuberance and flash and over-the-topness, how does that become reconciled with aging and middle age and a period of life that's about reflection rather than growth? To view Kerouac's life as a tragedy of squandered talent is to think in cliches. For the time Kerouac completed On the Road, he was indemnified against ever making or ever having made a serious mistake in his life. The value of a life cannot be assessed chronologically. He had waged everything on becoming a great writer, and he had won. Nothing can offset the achievement and victory of On the Road. And to be frank, I feel the exact way about David Foster Wallace and his essays and his novel. Nothing can take that achievement away. Period. They exist. Fact. So let's get in deeper into this for tennis, because we're already 50 minutes into the talk here. Romance and doom of That Will Never Die. You can see it still. You can hear it. Things change as you get older. Right now, I don't want to do anything except sit around writing. More accurately, revising this book. This feels like me. I don't want to do anything other than sit around and read books. And not just read books. Read the books I've already read. You know, maybe I'll like get ambitious enough to actually finish the, 4 last volumes of In Search of Lost Time by Proust one day, or the final, 100 pages of Brothers Karamazov that I haven't finished. But all the reading I want to do is rereading. Everything I want to read right now is stuff I've already read. And I guess ultimately, that's what this talk and this book chat is about. So if you want to do rereadings with me, get back here. And the same for movies and film, rewatchings. Kerouac's commitment to spontaneous prose did not stop him being sedulous, revising this draft in order to make it more spontaneous. For almost all authors, the labor of revision leads to improvement, until, after a point, the improvements become self-stifling, which is exactly what Kerouac feared. Oh, nice. A Hamlet quote here with a note of mine. What does it say? Hamlet didn't call it a sea of troubles for nothing. The more strictly stories of life on the ocean wave are stripped to their essentials, the more susceptible they are to shipping larger residents. Hemingway understood this and milked it to death in The Old Man and the Sea. In his struggle to stay afloat, Redford is like Sisyphus, who, Albert Camus insisted, we must imagine happy. God, what a lovely image. The idea that Sisyphus is happy, right? I mean, it's just one of the things we never talk about when we talk about Sisyphus, is how does he feel pushing that ball up the hill? What if he's in bliss? Blissful, Calvinist, action, working. Okay, now we get into tennis talk. You plan carefully, do everything correctly, and then at some point, something unpredictable, random, and entirely unforeseeable happens. You fix it. You continue on until the next setback. Acknowledging that it sounds like, quote, a dick thing to say, Andy Murray in the documentary Resurfacing says that after dutifully going through all the rehab following his first hip operation, he felt he deserved a better outcome. And this, as someone who recently tore my knee in half, probably ended my, in frank, intermediate level rock climbing life, I can relate to. We all feel that, right? That's universal. We thought we deserved a better outcome than a limp. I can, writes Gerald Manley Hopkins in one of the so-called terrible sonnets, can something, hope, wish day come, not choose to be. Okay. So we're really ripping through this whole book, The Last Days of Roger Federer, at record pace. But the whole thing sort of is about aging, procrastination, and what it means to retire or to be finished, and if Jeff Dyer can go on writing, or if he's going to stop writing. And it's interesting, to me at least, in connection to DFW, for the tennis metaphor, but also for the fact that DFW chose to not go on writing. He left us with a beautiful oeuvre, but he chose to stop. So here's Dyer on Lawrence, who he has a whole great book on. His last novel had been a hymn in praise of sexual rapture and renewal, but that was part of the process by which he reconciled himself to living without desire. Desire has died in me. Silence has grown. Neither writing nor painting. Letting the clock go round. There's nothing exceptional about this, Dyer says. It happens to everyone eventually, but it happened to Lawrence when he was in his early 40s. Lawrence recorded and wrote about everything he saw and smelled and touched with delicacy and deliberate abandon. He became notorious for writing things about bodies that, it was believed, should never be written about, and in language that should never appear in print. But there was one word he could not bring himself to use with regard to himself and his own body. Tuberculosis. That was unsayable, unspeakable. Time's Arrow, again. Maybe we can read Martin Amis' Time's Arrow on here once. That would be friggin' great. I'd love to revisit that. Okay, now we gotta get way deep into this here. I knew vaguely about Turner, he's talking about the painter, but only became properly interested in him when I read the essay About Looking, in which John Berger reminds us that the artist's dad ran a barber shop. Ooh, Rushmore references there almost, right? Wes Anderson tie. Without offering a definitive casual analysis, Berger asks us to consider some of his later paintings and imagine in the backstreet shop water, froth, steam, gleaming metal, cloud of mirrors, white bowls or basins in which soapy liquid is agitated by the barber's brush and detritus deposited. Consider the equivalence between his father's razor and the palette knife, which, despite criticisms and current usage, Turner insisted upon using so extensively. I love that. And of course, for Foster Wallace, consider the lobster and the influence of John Berger on him and his writing. Okay, now we're all the way up here to the contemporary, where Jeff Dyer is writing during COVID in 2020 in lockdown. So, continued to trace the moment of decline of the just past idol, further and further into the past, all the way to the last station stop, the unblemished terminus of the Garden of Eden. A reverse research project could document the ways in which fear of rumination keeps getting updated and projected by increments into the future, culminating with climate change, which involves the ruination of the very idea of a future. This is great. Such an undertaking would need to consider depictions of post-apocalyptic future in films like I Am Legend, 28 Days Later, and with the exception of Cormac McCarthy's The Road. That could be a week. We could do a film revisiting week of those on this channel. That'd be awesome. So, sci-fi catastrophe gradually shrank until it was knocking impatiently on the door of imminent. So it's fitting that anyone involved in such research would have found their endeavors had been derailed and overtaken by events as they were stranded by the reality of COVID lockdown in the empty streets of London in 2020, as recorded by the photographer Chris Dorley Brown. Check out that image. Beautiful stuff. Here, I'll disappear so you can see the edge of the frame there. Queen Elizabeth, of course, dying. The empty square. So beautiful, so prosaic. Looks like a photo of one of the Dusseldorf school, right? Like Thomas Struth or something. Or the photos of the libraries. The world left empty. Inhuman. Oh, great. And now there's a reference to Martin Amis, and I keep talking about Time's Arrow, so let's read that. One of Martin Amis's characters in The Pregnant Widow is well launched on the bullet train of his 50s. Dyer says, I've only just got off that one and onto the connecting train that sends you hurtling through your 60s. Given its ever-increasing potentially terminal velocity, I better start looking around now to make sure I don't miss my stop or leave any personal items behind. Or since the next train is actually the same train, the same one that came crawling out of childhood. Maybe I'll sit tight, stay on, and hope no one asks to see my age-stamped ticket. Rest in peace to Amos, of course, who also died just recently. I've got way too many notes in this book. I must have really loved it. There's a whole bunch of stuff on Nietzsche here that I'm not really excited to get into. So I'm going to skip over Nietzsche and I'm going to move into some stuff. Again, I'm really hoping to find the tennis tie-up, which has got to be in here somewhere. Oh, there's a bit on V.S. Naipaul. I love V.S. Naipaul. What a crotchety, funny man. I recently read The Enigma of Existence, and then I'm also reading, is it In a Dark Place? The one where he goes to India, something like that. Anyways, this is a reference to Conrad, Heart of Darkness. According to the version of events put forward in a novel, V.S. Naipaul was living in a cottage in Wiltshire when he came across a booklet with very small reproductions of paintings by De Chirico, with their occasional applied touch of easy mystery. The paintings did not make much of an impression on him, but one did snag his attention, perhaps because of the title, The Enigma of Arrival. Literally just finished reading it. The scene is of a Mediterranean or ancient Roman wharf in the background, beyond walls and gateways like cutouts. There's the top of the mast of an antique vessel. On an otherwise deserted street, in the foreground, there are two figures, both muffled. One, perhaps the person who has arrived, the other, perhaps a native of the port. The scene is of desolation and mystery. It speaks of the mystery of arrival. There you go. The painting gave Naipaul the idea of writing something about this strange and unsettling scene. He envisioned a man arriving at the classical port, walking past the muffled figures, and coming to a gateway or a door. Having entered the door, he would be swallowed up by the noise of a bustling and life of a bustling city. And then I have my own note here on the side that I'll read to you. This gives me a lightning bolt for what I was thinking about earlier, photography-wise, like Wall and his old assistant, like the Brit mentioned earlier in this book, for taking a fixed position time-lapse, but as layers, each revealed only partially so as to occlude, obscure, and blur the movement of time and beings on a fixed geographical point. Such a bridge, a wharf, a ferry dock, or the entrance to the church, also to transfigure and morph the time and nature of the landscape itself. Well, I like that. Interesting. I don't really know what I was thinking about. I guess about going out to start a photography project. Naipaul did not write this story, just as I did not complete that photography project. A story that was not pleased the publisher who commissioned it. I had finally been undermined, Naipaul writes. My spirit had broken. This is how I think Dyer is feeling in COVID lockdown and also with the passing of time and aging. I remember a 4-year wait between attempting Joseph Brodsky for the first time and completely falling for him. But that was from the age of 24 to 28, a period of time that now seems negligible, part of the same phase of my reading life. The best way I can describe it is via Chorin's wise observation that the further one advances in life, the less there is to convert to. Some writers are so strong, with so distinctive and profound a vision of the world, as to affect you in the psychic space where that urge to convert might once have resided. And that's definitely how I feel about David Foster Wallace, that having picked up Infinite Jest for the first time during undergraduate, so in the very early aughts, I don't think I would have actually touched him in the 90s when he was released. I remember finding a used copy of the book in an old secondhand bookshop in like Fenland Falls or Lindsay, Ontario, I think, and it was the cover with the orange and the black lettering on a sort of infinite cloud. Yeah, and then, just diving backwards into everything in the library stacks. Seeing that something is meant to be funny while having no urge to laugh is a recipe for misery. I gave up, and sticking with the W's, reread some Joy Williams stories instead. If you don't find her funny, then there's no point even having a sense of humor. A philosophical system built out of her work would completely remake the world. But that world would be exactly how it was. Hilarious, awful, wonderful, before the makeover. I love this. When you go through readings and you're physically, tangibly going through the alphabet on the bookshelf. I remember thinking about that because Volman coming before Wallace, of course. Although I might have been capable of reading certain kinds of books when I was younger, the fact is I didn't because I was too busy reading fiction. And while you write the kind of books you want to read, this doesn't mean that you read the kind of books you write. More often, you read the kind of books you're incapable of writing. Whoppers. Oh, and then there's a great Robert Caro reference here. Robert Caro is incredible and unreadable biographer. I really feel him on that. I love Robert Caro without ever having to, bother finishing one of his books. Knowledge has to be laid down in the brain in overlapping and crisscrossed layers. This makes me think of the palimpsest, which an image Margaret Atwood goes to a lot of, and I do find myself going to when I write. You need the underlay before you can have the carpet, and then you can abandon the analogy because it's completely unsustainable. Everything has gradually to become a kind of sediment in the brain. It's ocean floor, a place so dark and mysterious that the fish aren't even really fish. Just creatures without eyes or brains, flattened by the dead weight of water knowledge pressing down on them. Oh, what a lovely image. That makes me think of in Ponyo, the great Studio Ghibli classic animated film. In Ponyo, when the waves come up and the waves come to life, right? The wave creatures themselves take over. And then beneath them, there's these sort of ancient, archaic, prehistoric fish. Great shout there. Great way to get into Studio Ghibli shout. Okay, more Nietzsche, Henry Miller, Nietzsche, Henry Miller. Let's do a Henry Miller. Those same friends doubted this, but Miller was convinced that he would pass from art to life. To continue writing beyond the point of self-realization seems futile and arresting. The mastery of any form of expression should lead inevitably to the final expression, mastery of life. And I think this I really felt inflected with, right? For years when I was living in Mexico, I got into this Robert Bolaño phase and the sort of Dead Poet Society thing where, like, I thought of myself, my identity was as a poet, but, like, I rarely bothered to actually write poems. That wasn't the point. The point was to live like a poet. And you know, in some ways it was like the spontaneous writing of Kerouac, but really it was about spontaneous living. You know, writing at this point in the 2000s, I mean, what's the point of writing then? Everyone's on the internet. And maybe that's why now, really, if you really want to be making new literature, you should just be reading old literature or streaming it online. Back to the pain and the hip flexor. I love it. Somewhere in here, there's got to be a reference to Federer, right? I mean, the book's titled after him. Or maybe it's because he's the ineffable, irreplaceable, unreachable perfection and zenith. That hip flexor became a problem because I kept playing when I should have stopped, when the pain was mild. Quitting like that actually requires the self-discipline normally associated with persistence, with continuing to slog away at a book you're reading without pleasure. Playing through pain is invariably a recipe for further, more painful pain. But how about reading through the pain? I love it. But just because something's a classic doesn't mean it's any good. Status is not a guarantee of quality. And then we circle back to Manchester United, who, if you're a Man U fan like me, the number of great matches to leave early lately, and then all of a sudden they come through in the FA Cup against Liverpool. Football fans sometimes leave the stadium early, either to beat the crowds or when it's obvious that their side is on the wrong end, but there's always a chance of things being turned around in the dying seconds. Manchester United's 2-1 victory over Bayern Munich in the 99 Euros, when Bayern's ribbons were being tied to the trophy, is the most spectacular instance. We're definitely rewatching that on a sports hour. But also, it's the same, you know, with the goals, the late goals, the extra time goals in the FA Cup quarterfinal a few weeks ago against Liverpool, 120th minute. I mean, what a way to get a red card and rip your shirt off, Diallo. Good for you. Okay. I want to mention Alan Hollinghurst and the Swimming Pool Library because I love that book. It's his first novel, around the last summer of its kind there ever was to be. This was in 1983, the year I was born. A summer of unbridled gay carnality and hedonism before the AIDS epidemic. It was lent a larger resonance by an earlier last summer of 1914, rendered forever glorious by the catastrophic darkness that followed as the lights went out all over Europe. The glorious summer of 1914, to which Stefan Zweig would always think back in later years, when he uttered the word summer. Man, I love that. And then it references a book I don't know, Volker Wiedermann, in Summer Before the Dark. So the thing is here, I do think the older you get, regardless of whether you believe in any kind of afterlife, is that you have to start believing in the recursive nature of the world. Otherwise, you're going to fall prey to nihilism and to what's the point-ism. And I don't want to have anything to do with that. There's a lot of point. Okay, let's go all the way towards the end here. Wow, I must have really loved this book. I made so many notes. Absolutely nothing in here about Federer, though. It's great. Total nonsense. In fact, what it is recollections on his own youth. That's fun. Okay. So, this could be connected to David Foster Wallace. As everyone says, It's natural. Hey, what's up? Can you come back later? Can you come back during P1? I'm just doing something.
Pardon me?
Can you come back during P1 at 9:55?
At 9:55, yeah.
Yeah, just cheers. Thanks. So as everyone says, it is natural to be anxious, apprehensive, afraid. The key thing is to keep breathing, to remain calm, to go with it. The worst thing is to try and resist, because after that second or third scalding intake of smoke, whatever is going to happen is going to happen anyways. So if you're used to meditating, are familiar with breath control, then you can increase the chances of transforming a potential white-knuckle ride into a high-speed glide into this other world. They're all breathers, these Californians. Breathers, polyamorous, meditators, and doers of yoga, where I was just a breather in the normal, untutored English sense that I managed to keep doing it, without thought or discipline, for more than 60 years. Though there was a time I remembered from my childhood when my mother told relatives that I held my breath. It was a quite common thing among kids back then, a stripped-down instinctive protest against the terms and municipal conditions of being in the world. Such a lovely, childlike thing, the holding of breath as a revolt. It also makes me think of something like, Mr. Beast, who's counting to 100,000 or a million or whatever when he was a child, sort of made him famous. And then we're getting into a reference of an 1,100-page book with DMT, which really shouts out infinite jest. I first took acid in my early 20s, but what is the point of wisdom of having plowed through 1,100 pages of Black Lamb and Grey Falcon twice, like I plowed through Infinite Jest twice, if it reduces the chance of having the breakthrough experience of DMT even once? Isn't that the opposite of wisdom? Isn't it uniquely stupid? Especially since, as far as I can discover, DMT, unlike LSD, carries no risk of permanent mental damage or derangement once you reemerge from the ultimate permanence of eternity, aside from becoming a bit of a DMT bore. This is funny as hell because there's all these embedded references in Infinite Jest to Hal having taken DMT, and that's why he sort of goes crazy and into these childlike lullations and can't speak in the opening piece. In some ways, then, DMT experience is a test of one's self, and the result depends on one's ability to lose that self, to leave it behind for 10 minutes. And the echo of Nietzsche and David Foster Wallace is inevitable for all of eternity. The DMT realm, to know it's waiting there, preformed, as my dubber friend explained to another in a text, an entirely robust and intact and freestanding dimension. It's reassuring to know that it's not going anywhere anytime soon, that that's still there. That's what enables me to put off going there, to wait for another chance to break on through. Man, I love this. I don't think we're ever going to get back to tennis, but that's okay. We've taken a lovely digression here into California, where, of course, Foster Wallace died writing a book, The Pale King, that he'd never finish, which I don't know if we're ever going to get into rereading that. I read it once right afterwards and think it's probably best left unless you want to dig into it with me. But it's often said that writers have only one or two themes they consistently return to, finding new ways of addressing them, new fictional situations in which they can be explored. My theme, I have no doubt, is giving up. That's what's kept me going. And that's the connection to David Foster Wallace and tennis and athletics. So let's leave with this Lewis Gluck quote. I think here I will leave you. It has come to seem there is no perfect ending. Indeed, there are infinite endings. Or perhaps, once one begins, there are only endings. Adieu.